so excited to be talking about today one of my favorite things to make and use in baking, puff pastry. Now, just the word puff pastry scares so many people. So we are gonna break down the process today with all the things you need to know to try it at home. And we're not only gonna show classic puff pastry, we're also gonna show my super easy method for a secondary, much simpler type called rough puff. No matter which one you choose, we're gonna be using a lot of butter. So let's get baking. So first things first, what is puff pastry? And your answer might be, it's that thing I buy in the freezer section at the grocery store. And that puff pastry is good. But homemade puff pastry is even flakier, even crispier, and it browns so beautifully. It's just the best. And it is a process, but it's totally achievable, especially if you know what you're looking for. The way puff pastry works, you make a simple dough, you refrigerate that for a little while, then you make this big block of butter. We actually call the butter block. You seal that butter block inside the dough, and then the dough goes through a series of being rolled out and folded. So what's happening is you create this dough butter dough, and with every fold, you're creating more and more and more and more layers of dough and butter. When that dough hits the oven, the moisture inside the butter evaporates, creating steam. And that's what is responsible for creating those flaky layers that puff up and make it light, crispy, and so buttery. So there are three primary keys to success for puff pastry. The first is understanding the temperature. You always want your dough to be a combination of chilled but pliable. The second key is you don't want to incorporate too much flour. So you don't want to use a lot of flour on the surface or a lot of flour on your rolling pin, on your dough. Only use as much as is absolutely necessary. That's because that flour is getting incorporated into the dough, which can make it tough. And also excess flour can also prevent the layers from sticking together in a nice way. So every time you fold those layers, they don't really want to meld together. And as a result, the dough becomes really difficult to roll out with time. And what's the third key of my own success? The third and final key to making great puff pastry is allowing it time to rest. And this happens usually in the refrigerator because you're chilling it out, keeping that cool temperature that we already talked about. But also it allows the gluten to relax. When the gluten relaxes, that makes the dough easier to roll out. Whenever you roll out any dough and you roll it out and it just immediately comes back in, that means that the gluten hasn't had time to relax. So you want your dough chilled but pliable, you don't want to use too much flour, and you want to let it have some rest time so that it is relaxed. And that's what we're going to be as we make this puff pastry. This isn't hard, we're going to be relaxed. First thing, we're going to use 2 flours in our dough. Bread flour. Because of that higher protein content that bread flour has, it makes the dough a little bit more elastic. It's gonna make it easier to withstand all of these rollings. And we like that about bread flour. So we're gonna do 400 grams or 3 1/3 cup. And I'm using a scale because scaling is the most accurate way to measure, just to make sure you get it just right. And this makes a really big batch of puff pastry, but it's difficult to make puff pastry in smaller quantities. If you want to make a really small quantity, that's when you're going to want to make rough puff pastry, which we're going to talk about later. Also 200 grams of all-purpose flour. The reason I use a blend of these two because this has a lower protein content, so we're trying to get the elasticity from that bread flour, and then we're trying to get a little tenderness from this all-purpose flour. And we need 1½ teaspoon salt. Really important to season your baked goods, even if you're gonna make sweet things with your puff pastry. I'm gonna go ahead and put that on my mixer, give it a little stir just to get those dry ingredients combined. We're gonna add 1 stick, 4 ounces, 113 grams of room temperature unsalted butter. And we're gonna mix that for a minute here to combine. And what we're doing is we're kind of trying to break up that room temperature butter so that it's all dispersed throughout the dough. But we don't want it to fully combine. So we're basically kind of making it look for a second a little bit like pie dough, like there'll be chunks of butter in the dough. All right, so we've got our butter all mixed into little small pieces. So now I'm just gonna add 290 grams cool or room temperature water, which is 1 cup plus 3 tablespoons. And now we're just gonna let this mix until the dough comes together and is very smooth. It'll take a few minutes. Okay, so you know the dough is done when it forms a ball like this around the dough hook, and it's relatively smooth. This dough is not sticky when you touch it, but it's very pliable. And we're just gonna shape this into a rough rectangle. Whenever you're baking and you're gonna roll something out later, it is a good idea to get it to start in the shape that you want it to end up in, about 1 inch in thickness. But no need to be crazy precise. We'll worry about the precision later. And we just need to wrap this in plastic wrap and refrigerate it until it's chilled but still pliable. We don't want this dough to get totally firm so that when you try to bend it that it cracks. That's not good. But this is a little too pliable. See? That's soft, that's just mixed. So one of the great things about puff pastry is that the dough is so smooth and elastic that your bowl is still totally clean when you're done mixing it. So we're just gonna switch the attachment to make our butter block. We're gonna put on the paddle, and then we'll grab a few other ingredients, namely butter. We're making a butter block. So we're gonna do 1 pound of room temperature butter, 4 sticks, 453 grams. And it's important that the butter is at room temperature because we're gonna add one other ingredient to this, bread flour. For the same reason that we use bread flour in our dough, elasticity. I have found after lots of years of making puff pastry that adding just a little bit of bread flour to the butter really makes it move a little bit smoother. It makes it more similar in consistency to the dough. Just makes the whole process go a little easier. We're gonna add 70 grams, about 1/3 cup. And then we're just gonna mix this almost like you're mixing the beginning of a cake batter or a cookie dough, just until the two are combined and the butter is a little fluffy. I'm gonna grab a piece of parchment paper about the size of a half sheet tray, and I've got my handy offset spatula, and that's what we're gonna use to shape our butter block. So we're just gonna scrape this butter mixture onto our parchment. My pastry chefs in school always said, scrape like it's your Christmas bonus in the bottom of the bowl. We're gonna spread this about 1/2 inch thick into a rectangle shape. And the most important thing here is that you don't want the butter to be too thin, you don't want it to be too thick. So that 1/2 inch thickness is really what's important. I'm just spreading this with my offset spatula, and because the butter was room temp, it's really easy to spread. And when we roll out our dough, we can even use the butter block that we made as a guide, because we just need the dough to be a little wider than the butter on the sides and long enough that it can fold over the butter. One other thing that's kind of important with puff pastry, less important if you're a beginner, don't stress yourself out over it, but we do kind of want sharp edges and corners. If the edges are rounded everywhere where they meet the puff pastry, meet the dough, you're not gonna have a uniform layer. You're, instead of having dough, butter, you're gonna have kind of dough on dough on dough. So it's really important you're trying to make them basically snugly fit. I find this part of it very relaxing, just smoothing the butter. Like, I wish this was a job. I would just like do this all day. But we have puff pastry to make, so I'm not gonna do it all day. I'm instead gonna fold this paper over my butter block. And this is also great because I can use the paper to help me do the final shaping. First, I'm gonna press it on the top, and then I'm just gonna use my hands on the sides to help make a sharper edge. And on this edge too. So we are good to go with our butter block. We need to refrigerate this for the same texture and consistency. We want it to be chilled, but pliable. So into the fridge it goes. All right, so our dough is not so firm that when I turn it like this, that it breaks, but it's soft enough that it's gonna be easy to roll. I'm gonna use very little flour. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start rolling it out. It's gonna be a little tough at first, then it'll get easier. Our end goal is to roll this out to be twice the size and length as this butter block and just a little bit wider. so you can use it for reference as you roll. And if your dough feels too firm, you can get out some aggression by beating it like this, just to help get it a little thinner and make the rolling a little easier. And as I discussed before, it's good to keep kind of a rectangle shape. So sometimes I bring in my little tool here, my bench scraper, to help force the shape to have corners and straight edges. And in general, I think people are afraid of manipulating things to make them look the way they want. Like, again, I don't have the corners, so I'm just gonna stretch the dough and make it have corners. Look, now it's a rectangle. Okay, it's already almost too wide, so now I just need to focus on the length. And again, we're aiming for about 1/2 inch thick, but in this case, the coverage of this butter block is what's the most important. We wanna make sure that we can fold that dough fully over to encase it. If we don't encase it and we don't seal it well, that butter is just gonna come out the side as soon as we go to apply any pressure with the rolling pin. And now we'll test our butter block. Again, it's firm, it's not melty, but I can kind of bend it, and that's really the sign that it's ready to go. So I like to use the paper to help me line it up on the edge here and drop it onto the side of the dough that's closest to me, like that. Now we lock it in. Fold that dough over, and I'm just gonna press really firmly the dough together all the way around and really snugly. I'm gonna feel where the edge of the butter block is, and that's where I'm gonna press to seal. And I'm not just gonna press down, I'm almost gonna squish it outwards, and you'll see why in a second. So now we kind of have this these handles on our puff pastry. I'm gonna turn it over and fold that excess dough on the back, just so it's underneath the dough. And again, I'm gonna press pretty firmly with my fingertips. Don't be afraid of overdoing it. We really want that to seal in. The only thing you don't wanna do is you don't wanna poke so hard that you break through to the butter. We're trying to keep the dough intact. Now, this isn't wanting to stick. That's one of the things that can happen if you have a little too much flour. When you press, it just won't adhere. It just kind of pops off. So we can apply a tiny bit of water, or we can warm it up with our hands a smidge, and then it's gonna press. Okay, now I'm gonna turn it back over so those seams are down. We've got our little perfect packet here. We have locked the butter into the dough, and usually it's ready for its first fold right away. These first stages, you want to be a little bit gentle with the pressure that you apply, because if you have missed sealing the dough anywhere, this would be the time to fix it before you get too far down the road. You can turn it over, help press those seams to seal. And now what we're gonna do is we're trying to roll it out to 1/2 inch thick to perform our first fold. Okay, this is a classic problem that happens when you make puff pastry. I've got a little bulbous air pocket here. That's totally fine. We can solve it right now by poking it with something sharp, letting that air out, smushing it out, and then just pressing firmly down. Pop it, just make sure that you really press it firmly closed, or again, you risk the butter coming out there. So we're about there. I'm just continuing to stretch the dough. Now, this is why we want to keep it a rectangle, because again, if we do the first fold now and it's not rectangle, where they match up, we're going to have big chunks that don't have any portion there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and perform the first fold, which is a 4-fold. For that, we fold the top portion of the dough down about 1/4 of the way over the dough, and the bottom portion up to meet it. And this should sort of look like a book with an off-center spine, an open book with an off-center spine, like that. And then we're just gonna fold it in half, like that. And we've completed the first fold. So now we're just gonna wrap this in plastic wrap, let it rest in the fridge. We want it to be firm but pliable, but we also wanna give it about 15 minutes to let that gluten relax before we try to perform another fold. So our dough has been chilling and resting for a while after its first fold, still firm but pliable. So I'm going to go ahead and roll it out and do the second fold. Again, I'm only gonna use as much flour as I need. And you can see already the dough looks smoother now than it did when we did the first fold, and it's gonna continue to lighten in color and become smoother the more we work with it. Again, we're just aiming for a rectangle or around 1/2 inch thick. Ooh, look how smooth that dough is. And our next fold is called a 3-fold. And the way you perform that fold is by folding the dough, the top portion of the dough, down 1/3 of the way over the dough, and then the top third up over it. And that's all. So we'll wrap this up, chill it, give it a rest. Our next 2 folds are just repeating the same process of those first 2 again and allowing it to rest in between. So now I'm going to do the second 4-fold. Okay, ready to fold. So we're folding the top portion down 1/4 of the way, and we're folding the bottom portion up to meet it, like an open book with an off-center spine. Perfect. I'm gonna wrap this up, chill it, and then it'll be ready for its final fold. So our dough is chilled and ready for its final fold. When the dough is rested, it's so easy to roll it out because the gluten has relaxed. So the dough just does exactly what you tell it to. You're like, go over there, I'm gonna fold you. And it's like, okay, I wanna become palmiers or millefeuille or patinier or so many things. Brie wrapped in puff pastry, right? Okay. So I got a tiny bit of butter breakage here. This is a good opportunity to show it. When the butter breaks through, this is what it looks like. And what I'm gonna do to kind of fix it is I can tell that the butter's broken through because there's stickiness, and I can just tell that it's butter. So I'm just gonna sprinkle a tiny bit of flour right in that spot, and hopefully that flour will sort of coat the butter and keep it in place as I keep rolling. And we are gonna do our final 3-fold, which is the one where you sort of fold it like a business letter in thirds, like you're gonna put it into an envelope. Okay, so I folded the top portion, the top third down, 1/3 of the way over the dough, and I'm folding the bottom third up over it. And that, my friends, was our final fold. We just made puff pastry, classic puff pastry, the fancy, fancy French way. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna wrap this tightly in plastic wrap, and we're gonna wanna refrigerate it for at least 8 hours before using it. It can also be frozen for up to 3 months, wrapped tightly in plastic wrap, and just thaw it before using, which is one of the great things about puff pastry. Freezes great, keeps in the fridge, so you can kind of make a day of it, make this big project, and then enjoy the fruits of your labor, the puff pastries of your labor. So I get lots of questions about puff pastry, and the number one is, if it's so temperature sensitive, what am I trying to avoid? Because it's easy enough to say it should be firm but pliable, and I showed you what that looks like. But it's just as important, I think, to show you the wrong way. So in front of me, I've got a dough that is too warm. First thing that you're gonna notice when I pick it up, like it just is like flimsy. The second thing is it's holding indentations when I touch it, whereas the other one, I was putting my hand on it and I could just lift it right up. So I'm gonna go ahead and roll out a little of this dough and show you, because as you can see, as I'm smushing this down, it's just doing just that. It's smushing. So as it's smushing, the dough is kind of pushing down and out, and what it's doing is it's pushing directly into the butter and just fusing with it. So what you're doing is you're just kind of making a dough that has a lot of butter in it rather than making those careful layers, what you're trying to achieve with puff pastry. So this floppy guy is a no-no. The other no-no is this. And this is what happens when puff pastry gets too cold. When you go to roll it out and fold it, the butter inside is so cold that it breaks into many pieces. So you can see that right here in this dough. And again, it's not a terrible thing. It's still probably going to puff up when you bake it, but the layers are gonna be really uneven, and it's more likely that the butter is gonna melt out or break out in a situation like this. When you have one of these problems with your dough, your best bet when the dough is too soft and the butter is too soft is to try to return it to the fridge to firm it up again. You have the best chance of success at any of these when earlier on in the process. As it gets later on in the process, it becomes harder to do anything about it. If the butter is broken inside, you can just proceed with the dough. It still has a chance to form some flakiness. It just isn't going to be as nice. And I just think seeing what it should look like, seeing those visual cues is gonna help prevent you from having these issues, because you understand that firm but pliable, not this and not that. Now let's get back to the good stuff. All right, if you just watched me break down that puff pastry and that still seems too difficult for you, never fear, because I am debuting world premiere right here on Food 52, my brand new rough puff pastry recipe, which is in my upcoming cookbook, The Book on Pie. The pros of rough puff, the whole process goes much faster. The folds are less finicky. You're just rolling out the dough and folding it in quarters rather than having these very specific folds. You don't have to make a butter block. You can make it in much smaller quantities. You can make, just one single portion rather than needing to make a larger amount. And the cons are it just isn't as precise as puff pastry. So you can't do effects like scoring, but it's just as flaky, just as crisp, just as golden brown. For 90% of the things that you're gonna be doing at home, you can use rough puff and you're gonna be really happy. So let's give it a try. I'm gonna start by putting 300 grams of all-purpose flour into my bowl here. And I'm also gonna add a hefty couple pinches of salt. Just gonna give that a quick little stir to combine it. Now we're going to cut 2 cold sticks of butter into 1/2-inch cubes. And I do have a particular way I do this, just because I cut a lot of butter into cubes. It's kind of my thing. So I cut it in half lengthwise on both pieces. Then I turn both sticks over and cut them in half lengthwise again. And then we just cut them into cubes. And for this, we want pretty big sized cubes. With rough puff pastry, instead of making a butter block, we're just gonna mix the butter into the dough, but leave it in large pieces. Then as the dough is folded, the butter is shingled and slowly becomes smaller and incorporated in the dough in thin strips. Okay, just break up all your cubes of butter and make sure that each piece is coated fully in flour. And this is important for the shingling step that we're gonna do. When it's coated in flour, it's gonna be less likely to melt, and it's gonna be less likely to melt out of the dough later, which is one of the #1 problems with any kind of puff pastry, is if it's not laminated well, the butter will just melt out of the dough in the oven and you'll end up with a really crisp dough that's not flaky. So I already did the first piece, but I'm gonna show you what we're gonna do. Take cubes in your hands and squish them between your fingers and your thumbs, like that. And this is the same technique that you use to make pie dough, the same technique you use to make biscuits. And in those techniques, you just mix the butter in a little more than we're gonna do here. I developed this rough puff pastry recipe to work in pie recipes that benefit from, a slightly flakier dough like puff pastry. But I love it so much that I've since used it to make all the same kinds of things that I make with regular puff pastry. Okay, so all my pieces have been shingled, and then I'm just tossing them in flour one more time. Again, I wanna make sure all those pieces are really nicely coated. Now I'm gonna make a well in the center, and I'm gonna add a little ice water. And I'm just gonna do this by eye, at least a 1/2 cup. but often it's a little more, sometimes in rare situations it's also a little less. But that's why it's great to do things like this by eye, because every single brand of flour absorbs moisture differently. So unless I tell you, you gotta use this specific brand of flour, it's difficult for me to tell you exactly how much water to use to get the consistency right. So I'm just gonna go ahead and fill that well in the center with some water. I can always add more, can't take it away. And at first, I'm gonna start by tossing the dough like this. And this helps the water start to incorporate with the flour without starting any kind of kneading that could activate gluten or anything that could make this dough a little more tough. When it gets to this stage where it's sort of started to form large clumps, but it's not together, that's when we can knead it a couple of times to see how much moisture we still need. And we're gonna knead a little bit. Sometimes what I like to do is take the amount that has come together and lift it out of the bowl, and then just add some more water to what's left, because that's what needs to be hydrated still. And getting the hydration right on this dough is important, because if it's too wet, it's going to be really sticky and tough to work with, and it's gonna end up having that problem that I just discussed, being a little bit crisp rather than tender and flaky. And if it's too dry, it's also gonna be difficult to roll out, but instead of being sticky, it's gonna crack. I hate that. It's one of my biggest pet peeves when you're rolling out a dough and it just will not stay together. It just keeps falling apart or crumbling or cracking. But that shouldn't happen if a dough is properly hydrated. You just need enough moisture, and that will not be a problem. And the idea here is to work as quickly as possible. If you take too long, the heat of your hands could start to melt that butter, and we need it to be in big, big pieces. Okay, just like that, our dough is already ready to go. And that's what it looks like. You can see these big fat pieces of butter, like look at that one. Big fat pieces, and we're gonna roll it out and shingle them and make them smaller. So the same things apply to rough puff pastry as apply to full classic puff pastry. You're still worried about temperature, you're still worried about using too much flour, and you're still worried about the dough relaxing. However, because we're not using bread flour, and because this is a slightly smaller quantity, it is possible to speed up the process a little bit. So if after mixing your dough feels at all sticky or tacky, which as you can see, mine doesn't, nothing comes up. You might want to chill it for a few minutes before continuing, but if you work relatively quickly, you can go right into the first set of folds. So I'm gonna go ahead and lightly flour my work surface, very light, because I really don't want much. And I'm gonna roll out the dough to about 1/2 inch thick. And one thing I like to do in this first stage of folds is if I see any pieces of butter that come out to the edge, I like to just stick them into the middle, because any pieces of butter that stay at the edge aren't really gonna get shingled in, and it's worth it to make sure that they're incorporated and not stuck on the edges. And I'm aiming for approximately a rough rectangle shape, but again, this is rough puff pastry, so we're not being as precise about it, and you can kind of just roll it out, whatever shape it is, it will be fine. Give it one more roll here. I like to use these pins with no handles, because then I can just sort of apply pressure to the areas that I need to help make it more rectangular in shape, like that, which is really neat. But rolling pins, any kind of technique like that, it's really about what's easiest for you. So I got a little excited about rolling, and I actually rolled this out closer to 1/4 inch thick, but that's okay. This is rough puff, anything goes. So I'm just gonna fold it in half, then I'm gonna fold the half in quarters, and I'm just gonna squish the ends together again to make it a rough rectangular shape. Now, again, if your dough is still pretty chilled, you can move right into the second set of folds before refrigerating it. If it's feeling soft, sticky, giving you any kind of trouble, now would be the time to toss it in the fridge for a few minutes before continuing. So that's a little more like the thickness that we want. Just about 1/2 inch thick. Fold it in half again, so it's a nice little rectangle in quarters. And now we're not gonna try for a third fold right off the bat, because This dough definitely needs to rest to relax that gluten. So we're gonna wrap it in plastic wrap, refrigerate it, and then we're just gonna roll it out 2 more times and do those same fold into quarters, and the dough is done and ready to use. Whenever possible, it's great to refrigerate it overnight before using, and if not, just at least an hour before you're ready to use it, and it's good to go. This rough puff has chilled and relaxed, and now we can give it the 2 final folds. And as you can see, as I roll it out now, the butter is in much smaller pieces distributed throughout the dough, and the dough itself has started to look a little lighter in color. One of the many things I like about the rough puff pastry is it just gives you the opportunity to be more casual. No specific measurements, you're just trying to get an approximate thickness and an approximate shape. As long as you work quickly and it's not like a hot August day where it's very humid, you can almost always perform 2 folds back to back. Just know you're gonna be working your arm muscles a little on that second one because the dough hasn't fully relaxed. And theoretically, you could keep rolling and folding this. And the more you roll and fold, you're gonna get more and more layers. But I can attest, this rough puff gets very flaky. Dare I say, flaky AF. All right, perfect. I'm just gonna fold this in half and fold it in quarters. And then at this time, if you want to do something with it where you don't want it in a rectangle shape, you could kind of tuck the ends under to make it a little more round, but I'm gonna use it to make a fruit kind of galette. So I'm just gonna leave it as a rectangle like this, wrap it in plastic wrap, and it's good to go. Just like that, we went start to finish to make this rough puff. It's so much easier than classic puff pastry, but it's just as flaky and tender and buttery and delicious. I love it. Okay, so now that we have our final puff pastry, I think it's just kind of nice to show what the final puff pastry looks like in comparison to the rough puff pastry. Again, the rough puff pastry is a little bit coarser still, it's not as smooth, but that's just the nature of the product. It still puffs up really beautifully. And the other nice thing about that rough puff is we can make it in a smaller quantity, which means it all goes a little bit faster, it's quicker to chill, all of those things. And because it's a little bit difficult to see the layers because the dough and the butter are the same color, I made another dough with chocolate so that you can see all those little white layers inside. That's the butter inside the dough. And that's when it hits the oven, that moisture evaporates from the butter, creating steam, making the puff pastry. And it's really, really incredible. So this is just a little cocoa added to the dough just for the sake of demonstration to show how cool those layers are. That's puff pastry. The real reason I love puff pastry is because it's so versatile. There are so many things you can do with it. And here are just a few of my favorites. All these recipes are on Food 52. You've got my cranberry pétivier. A pétivier is a double crust puff pastry pie. And we've done that beautiful scoring effect on this and it just looks awesome. We also have this classic dessert, which is called a mille-feuille, which means million layers, many layers. And mille-feuille is baked by cutting little rectangles and then baking it with another baking sheet on top so that the layers stay flat, and then you stack them with cream and fruit, and it's delicious. And one of my favorite desserts of all time, the palmier, which is just sweet enough, really deeply caramelized, and so crispy and flaky, just like insanely good. Crazy good to eat. Love a palmier. And then that rough puff pastry we used to make this incredibly beautiful tart. You would have never known that it was rough puff and any different than these other ones. Again, puff pastry, there are so many options. You can go the savory route and make incredible appetizers for your favorite events and holidays. All kinds of things from entrees, appetizers, to desserts, snacks. Making your own puff pastry is so worth the effort, especially if you just want to tackle that rough puff and make it a little easier on yourself. So I really hope you enjoyed following this adventure we went on today, making so much puff pastry. If you have any questions about puff pastry that I didn't answer, be sure to let me know in the comments so I can get you some answers to your burning pastry questions. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so that you can be here to bake with me in the future. Happy baking!